And thank you everybody for coming tonight. Uh, this is again our monthly series featuring different topics in maritime history. We're trying this year to rotate regularly again between different topics, different parts of the country, and certainly our topic tonight is one that's appropriate for the 250th anniversary that we're going to be celebrating this year. And let me just tell you a little bit about our speaker that we're so happy to have with us here tonight. Uh, Professor Charlie Neimeyer is graduated from the University of Maryland and was a military officer in the U.S. Marine Corps for many years. And during his 20 years of active military service, included a number of different stations, divisions, including strategic planning at headquarters at Marine Corps, with the Marine Corps, at the White House under Presidents H.W. Bush and Clinton, and also as an instructor at the U.S. Naval Academy and Naval War College. He's also been serving in various capacities since he left active service, including his continued work with the Naval War College, teaching with them. He's published numerous military history articles in many journals and magazines, and he also has authored a number of books as well. So without further ado, Professor Neimeyer, I will turn this over to you. Thank you for
Thank
joining us.
thank you very much. I'm looking forward to it. Let me get my screen up here. We'll get the slides started. And as soon as I can get this first slide up here, we'll get going. Okay, there it is. We'll go to slideshow, and then we'll go from the beginning. Okay, American Revolution or the early war at sea is what we're going to cover tonight. This is going to be a real quick, fast and furious thing of the first couple of years, the establishment of the early Navy, as well as the early Marine Corps, and talk about the raid at New Providence, Bahamas in 1776, and then we'll conclude with that. So I'm going to get that in probably about 40 minutes, and then I'll take Q&A. I'll go down the questions that I've been given in advance. I'll try to answer most of those up front, and then we'll take some if you have any in the chat after that. Okay, so first thing we have to realize is that the idea of having a Navy was argued within the very first year of the Continental Navy or Continental Congress going to war against Great Britain, and it was after obviously Bunker Hill and Lexington and Concord, but they began to wisely argue that maybe the time has come to build at continental expense, and that's important to understand, continental expense, a fleet of sufficient force for the protection of these colonies and for employing them in such a manner in places that will most effectively annoy our enemies. And John Adams replies that, yes, the opposition was very loud and vehement, and it was. Because most of the southern colonies and even the middle colonies said that, well, this Navy is probably going to be utilized by New England, so why do we have to pay for that? So there was still that kind of regionalism that was being demonstrated here. Samuel Chase of Maryland says, it's the maddest idea in the world. Edward Rutledge of South Carolina says, it's the most wild, visionary, mad project that ever been imagined. And Rutledge further predicts a Navy would ruin the character and corrupt the morals of all our seamen, making them selfish, piratical, mercenary, and wholly bent on plunder. Well, maybe he was right in that last one. So here's the guy that really was the power behind the scenes. This is John Adams, Massachusetts, of course. He authors the creation of the Navy Act that's going to create the Navy on 13 October 1775. It is the second oldest service, only second to the United States Army. And so the Navy is going to come into being, and John Adams is going to actually argue that, well, it shouldn't be too hard to create a Navy. We can probably build one in about 4 months. And he was serious when he said that. Unfortunately, he was way, way wrong. But he thought so at the time. So following the months of debate, Congress votes immediately after they approve the Navy. 2 vessels they want to arm, the Cabot and the Andrew Doria, to intercept British transports carrying troops and military supplies, and then authorizing the construction of 13 new frigates, 13 states, 13 frigates. They don't get 13, they get a number of them None of them come to a good end during the war. In fact, by 1780, after the Battle of Charleston, the Continental Navy, for all intents and purposes, is over. They appoint a Rhode Islander named Essek Hopkins. He is the brother of Stephen Hopkins as one of its first overall commander. They commission 18 officers. They create eventually, on 10 November 1775, 2 Marine battalions, which I'm going to talk to in a minute. They establish service pay and subsistence tables, authorize prize monies, no small factor here for 18th century navies, because one way in which you might get just wildly rich beyond your wildest imagination would be to take a prize, especially a merchant prize, because everybody splits the money that's then given to all the way down to the lowest level of sailor on any ship. For the sale and the capture of warships, they adopted a naval code of discipline. It was written by John Adams. They formed an administrative body called the Marine Committee to give force, guidance, and direction to a new Navy. Here's the Navy uniforms that you're going to be seeing. These are rather formal uniforms. Not everybody had these uniforms, but they had a form of them in this first early Continental Navy ship. So we have 2 ready to go, Andrew, Doria, and Cabot. There's going to be more to follow, as we're going to see. So the first Commodore is this guy, Essek Hopkins. He, unfortunately, is not necessarily going to be a great leader. He's going to be an adequate leader. But Essek Hopkins is a New Englander, and therefore he has seagoing experience. This is a rather kind of bold portrait of him. But as one historian once noted about poor Essek Hopkins, he was an ordinary man placed in an extraordinary time. He's, as we're going to see, he does okay, but not really great. And at the end, we're going to discuss what happens to him. But he's going to lead this first squadron that's going to be formed. Now, they're going to form this squadron for a variety of reasons. One is they got to get some ships at sea. They're going to do the service of the Continental Congress, so to speak. But they also are worried about what's happening to the south. Toward the south, there's some activity going on that is greatly concerning the middle and southern states. Although the war largely is still in New England up to this point, even in New York by 1776, eventually by 1776. The southern and middle colonies are concerned about British raiders coming from the sea because there really is no defense for them with the large, long seafronts that these colonies possess. So the Marine Committee, Stephen Hopkins of Rhode Island, by the way, John Adams loved this guy. He's a brother. He thought he was a man about town. He treated everybody to drinks every night, but it had people like Josiah Bartlett, William Ellery, Christopher Gadsden of South Carolina, Joseph Hughes, John Langdon, Francis Lewis, and William Whipple, among others. All highly regarded congressional members, but not considered top-tier members like the committee that oversaw the Army. Very, very different. This committee compounds things by grossly underestimating the cost and time to build naval vessels. They never do get it right. So what's the first squadron look like? That was one of the questions, what were the names of the U.S. ships? Well, the flagship is going to be the Alfred. It's considered to be the first frigate for the Continental Navy. 30 guns, commanded by Captain Dudley Saltonstall, although he'll be the flag captain. Essek Hopkins will largely occupy a cabin on board the Alfred as well as the Commodore. Then the Columbus, which is slightly smaller, 28 guns, Captain Abraham Whipple. I put the words where they were located and where they came from, their origins. Alfred's formerly the Black Prince. It was out of Philadelphia. The Columbus was another ship out of Philadelphia. The Andrew Doria, also out of Philadelphia, 14 guns under Captain Nicholas Biddle. Nicholas Biddle is a Philadelphia person. Captain John B. Hopkins out of Philadelphia has the Cabot, 14 guns. Providence, the first Rhode Island ship. Actually, there's a replica of the Rhode Island, the Providence here in Alexandria, Virginia. I've been on it, sailed on it a number of times myself, helped raise the gaff rig sail myself when we were sailing around Narragansett Bay in it before it came south here to Alexandria. It's first commanded by Captain Hazard, the famous Oliver Hazard Perry family. He's related to those guys, obviously well before Oliver Hazard Perry. And later, John Paul Jones himself, who was first lieutenant on the Providence during the New Providence raid. The Hornet, 10 guns, Wasp, 8 guns, Fly, 6 guns, all built out of the state of Maryland, commanded by Marylanders William Stone, Charles Alexander, and Hoisted Hacker. So this is the first squadron. These are the ships that you get. Again, one of the comments that John Jay is going to tell George Washington in 1779 about the Marine Committee is that, while the maritime affairs of the Marine Committee under the direction of the Marine Committee itself consists of a delegate from each state, it fluctuates. New members constantly coming in and old ones going out. 3 or 4 indeed have remained in it from the beginning. Very few of the members understand or even state our naval affairs or have time or inclination to attend them. So he says that this is a second-rate committee. They're really not on top of things. Washington is so concerned about the Continental Navy, he employs his own Navy. There was a great book written by a guy named James L. Nelson called Washington's Secret Navy, where Washington purposely avoids the scrutiny of Congress early on in the war. He employs John Glover and his Marblehead, Massachusetts regiment to outfit and man the 78-ton schooner Hannah. He later adds the Franklin, the Hancock, the Lee, and the Warren, and creates a little squadron up there in Massachusetts Bay and near Maine, and was moderately successful in interdicting British supply runs coming from Canada to its beleaguered forces penned up inside Boston. Many people don't know about this little secret Navy, and neither did Congress at the time. George Washington funded it out of his own funds and from benefactors as well in Massachusetts. So what are some of the early Navy and Continental Marine Corps missions or Marine missions? Well, first thing is they need to interdict British shipping between the West Indies, Halifax, and Quebec. They're going to use the coast, up and down the coast. They're going to be coastal trade, basically going up and down. They're also going to utilize commerce raiding in British home waters to keep the home fleet tied down potentially there by using privateers, meaning people were given a letter of marque and could take shipping at sea, which they could then condemn at Admiralty Court and allow them to then become wealthy if they're successful. Most privateers do not become wealthy. In fact, most privateers become POWs in some fetid British prison in England. The disruption of British commercial operations when possible by Continental Navy vessels. And finally, Marines to provide shipboard security and landing party reinforcement as needed, manning the fighting tops during the ship-to-ship engagement. This is what the Marine Corps or the Continental Marines initially was established for. And when the Marine Corps is officially established after the Constitution is written and becomes a U.S. Marine Corps, that's exactly what they still do. One of the first flags to be flown from the Continental Navy ships is the Appeal to Heaven flag. This is going to be flown by Continental Navy Captain John Manley. He flies this from the mast of his ship. He's not part of Essek Hopkins' squadron, but it's important to understand that they're experimenting with a number of flags at the beginning. It's not the flag that we remember with the stars in a circle and the stripes. They had a number of flags they started off with in this early Navy period. So state navies often get overlooked. A lot of people, when they do an analysis of the Revolutionary War, especially the early Continental Navy, forget all about the state navies. Most of the states had, many of the newly declared independent states created their own navies designed largely for local defense and the prevention of smuggling. So they're going to build smaller ships. They're going to even build row galleys, but they're going to build these state navies, and they're going to become very effective at local security. Many of the Pennsylvania State Navy, for instance, was assigned to defend Delaware Bay and do a fairly credible job until the British decided to take Philadelphia in 1777. It's moderately successful, as I said. Combination of sailing vessels and row galleys. Why are row galleys so good? Because you don't depend on the wind. You can use them and go anywhere you need to. Don't need to have the wind in your favor, and they're shallow draft. The downside of a row galley is nobody wants to serve in them because you don't want to be in rowing up and down rivers and having to row faster and further than anybody else because you're really going to get tired quick. So row galleys and sailing vessels, of course, you're not going to be using them on the high seas. They're going to be coastal navies. So in 10 November, as I said before, 1775, the Marine Corps, by the way, when I first became a U.S. Marine, one of the very first things you learn, and it's drilled into your forehead by your drill instructor, is the birth date of the Marine Corps. At 10 November 1775, I will dare you to ask any U.S. Marine you run into ever, what's the birthday of the Marine Corps? If they fail to answer the correct date, they have to buy you a lot of beer. You ask other members of other services, they might get their birthday right. Many do not. They don't really emphasize their birthdays in other services as much as the Marine Corps emphasizes 10 November 1775. 2 battalions of Marines are to be raised, consisting of 1 colonel, 2 lieutenant colonels, 2 majors, and other officers that consists of equal number of privates and other battalions. And as such, basically, they're going to be appointed as officer and enlisted men in the said battalions, but as such as are good seamen or so acquainted with maritime affairs as to be able to serve for and during the present war with Great Britain and the colonies, unless dismissed by Congress. May be distinguished by the names of the 1st and 2nd Battalions of Marines. Now, I can tell you that that was what it was on paper. George Washington never liked the Continental Marines. He saw them as competitors for his Continental Army. He didn't appreciate the fact that the Continental Navy was trying to recruit soldiers, especially from the Philadelphia area, which was our most heavily populated city at the time in the colonies. And he saw them as competitors to the Continental Army, and he wasn't happy about the establishment of this particular little detachment of Marines. And so as a result, you're not going to see 2 battalions get totally formed. You're going to get 4 or 5 companies. They're never going to get quite to 2 battalions, but nevertheless, mainly Philadelphia based, as we're going to see. Birthplace of the Marine Corps is called Tun Tavern. This is a fanciful drawing of it. It could have been any, they think it looked maybe like this, but that was the place where the Continental Marines were established. It was also the establishment of one of the first officers who commanded a company named, his name was Robert Mullen, and he owned Tun Tavern. And there were other taverns in the Philadelphia area that also recruited Continental Marines, but it was predominantly a Philadelphia entity at its start. So that's important to remember. They were distinguished with their green jackets. They oftentimes did not necessarily have those. Individual ship captains might outfit their own company of Marines in a different way. For example, in 1778, John Paul Jones, when commanded a Bonhomme Richard, had his Marines in red coats. Can you imagine that? Red-coated Marines. And they weren't even American Marines. They were French Marines, but they weren't even French Marines. They were Irish Marines serving for the French king, the Regiment Walsh. And they were on the Bonhomme Richard. So we had 3 different levels of separation of Marines on the Bonhomme Richard in 1778. But generally, they wore green coats with brown facings and black hats with a side folded over on the right side there, or left side, I'm sorry. Okay, this is what the uniform looked like early on with white facings. Later on, they had red facings. And look at this, a volunteer has a red coat. Most of the men who wore that coat did not appreciate it. Nobody liked being a red coat. That was kind of considered to be kind of an enemy dress. So it wasn't a very popular uniform. This is the uniform in reality. Once I got to see after a few months, they didn't look so good. And so I always like to include this picture because the other one was, this is the ideal, this is the real. So this is what they look like probably when they went ashore at New Providence in 1776. Okay. All right. So what was the original purpose of Essek Hopkins Squadron going to the Bahamas? Well, first thing you have to understand is its target wasn't the Bahamas. And that's going to be a problem later for Hopkins. It's going to be a problem for everybody. But this guy is Lord Dunmore. John Murray, Earl of Dunmore, is the royal governor of Virginia, who gets run out of town by the folks that are down there, the Sons of Liberty that are there, and he takes up on vessels in the Chesapeake Bay. Okay, and the vessels in the Chesapeake Bay are important to understand because he forms like a little naval militia, and they are tearing up the James River. They are tearing up every place here and there. Okay, so as a result, you have Lord Dunmore really frightening a lot of the leadership down there in the Virginia and Maryland region. So they said once this Continental Squadron is formed, well, what better place to come and to drive the coast from these guys that are raiding ashore and get rid of these guys once and for all, use these Continental vessels. So the intent was, and I believe the way they got the middle and southern colonists or the delegates to vote for the Navy was they said, that, okay, once we get the Navy, we'll send them south to get rid of the raiders. So that's the purpose of Hopkins's squadron. They're going to form up in the Delaware Bay just outside of Philadelphia for this raid in early 1776. And the raid target is not the Bahamas. The raid target is the Chesapeake Bay, but they never show up, as we're going to see. The original orders, Hopkins said, to operate against Dunmore's Royal Navy militia, is told to head directly to the Chesapeake Bay. But if he believes his force was too inferior, he was authorized to take it elsewhere, i.e. the Bahamas. But he's never explicitly told to do this. Congress suggested operations in North Carolina and South Carolina after he goes to the Chesapeake. but Hopkins never really does any intelligence gathering about what is in the Chesapeake region. Therefore, he's going to tick off none other than Thomas Jefferson himself, who believes that Hopkins never intended to come to the Chesapeake, that he always intended to go to the Bahamas because that was a much more lucrative target for looting and plunder than the Chesapeake Bay and driving off Dunmore's naval militia. Hopkins experiences initial weather delays in the Delaware Bay. He makes slow progress towards the Chesapeake. He doesn't really want to go there. Okay, so that's important to understand. Okay. So what are some early roles and missions? Again, it's very similar to the Royal Marine Organization of the Continental Marines. Again, serving as shipboard security and fighting tops, repelling borders, guarding Navy yard storage guards, acting as regular infantry in the land campaign. Is again the green coats, white facings, black gaiters, black felt hat, 6.9 caliber musket with a 22-inch triangular socket bayonet. Nasty. By the way, in the 18th century, I always tell my students, people think the musket is the weapon of decision on the battlefield. It is not. The musket, highly inaccurate, would maybe get 1 or 2 rounds off before they would charge with bayonets. Bayonets are what did the business in the 18th century, and that was seen as the way you win battles was the use of the bayonet. So the Marines were instructed into how to use the bayonet at close quarters. The Philadelphia influence is evident. Samuel Nicholas is from Philadelphia. He's a former Quaker who was kicked out of the meeting because he joined a military organization, the Continental Marines. The Tun Tavern legend, we don't exactly know where it is. We believe it might be underneath the present-day footings of the Betsy Ross Bridge that crosses the, I think it's the Schuylkill River. George Washington is opposed, as I said, never quite get to 2 battalions. Samuel Nicholas, however, is considered to be the first Marine Commandant, although he's never called that. He just happens to be the senior Marine in charge of the Marines. He also is considered to be their paymaster. Again, Philadelphia emphasized, Philadelphia based. There's the fighting tops and Marines in it. They're firing down on the enemy combatants. They're throwing grenades over the side and that sort of thing. And that's what you see Marines doing at sea, but ashore they would form portions of landing parties. They would be also backed up by blue jackets or regular seamen who would join the landing parties. It would be a combined joint force that would go ashore on almost every landing all the way up through the 20th century. Okay. This Samuel Nicholas is a portrait of him. That's the one that's hanging in the Pentagon as the first commandant of the Marine Corps. Again, never called that. Shows him in his green coat with white facing. He's later going to be promoted to major for his service at New Providence raid during the war. He gets, that's as high as he goes. Eventually, the Marines are going to be out of business by around 1780, 1781. He only commands a few detachments in the Philadelphia area at the end of the war. And then, of course, the Marines are dead. Continental Marines are disestablished, as is the Navy at the end of the Revolution. They don't come back until the 1790s. So let's talk now about the subject at hand, the New Providence raid. So Hopkins is told to go to the Chesapeake, and there's nothing to gain for him there. No loot, nothing to be taken. So they're going to have to get down to this area because they were told through some intelligence that there are military stores there, particularly gunpowder. This is something that the Continental Army and George Washington desperately needs. Tell you how important it is. In 1774, when Thomas Gage comes to Massachusetts and Boston, what he believes is the way to defeat the insurgency is to take their gunpowder. So he begins a series of gunpowder raids. One reason why we have a battle at Lexington and Concord in 1775 on April the 19th was another one of his powder raids is being conducted, trying to take the powder away from the colonists so that they could not resist the military occupation of their colony, i.e. Gage and his red-coated regiments. Take their powder, they can't fight back, and that was the strategy. But there was a good reason for that strategy because there wasn't much of it in the colonies. There were a lot of gunpowder factories. It wasn't easy to make. They had to import a lot of it. So therefore, if you could find some storage of it somewhere, it might help the Army and the cause. So the idea was maybe we can get down to New Providence. You know, again, it wasn't the explicit idea to get there, but then there is some evidence that maybe we can get some of the gunpowder that's stored in some of those forts down there. There are 2 forts to be known guarding the big islands down there, New Providence. One is Fort Montagu, and the other one is Fort Nassau itself. Both on separate islands, but they're both close together, and they are where the development is. So the New Providence raid, you're going to see Marines coming ashore. It's an unopposed attack. They use the ship's boats. These are the long boats you see. They're oar powered. They just row them ashore, beats the boats, and then they go ashore. Samuel Nicholas is going to initially lead the landing party ashore, as we're going to see. And then they're going to be later follow-on waves coming in of Blue Jackets and other Marines from the various vessels out there in the harbor of Essek Hopkins flotilla of 8 ships. So Hopkins, again, as I said, was supposed to go to Chesapeake. He was seen as a naval counterpart, by the way, to George Washington, and he was not. The first American vessel to fly the Grand Union flag, and I'll talk about that in a bit, is hoisted by none other than First Lieutenant John Paul Jones aboard the Providence. He's the first lieutenant, second in command of the Providence. That's a 12-gun sloop of war. The squadron demonstrates the first use of Continental Marines in an amphibious assault, and Hopkins is eventually going to be relieved well after the raid is over with, upon his return to Rhode Island waters. Compare that to Samuel Nicholas, who gets promoted to major. Hopkins is going to lose his commission and service in the Navy. I'll provide reasons why at the conclusion of this lecture. One of the questions was his relief merited? Was he treated unfairly? Well, you tell me then after we get done. We'll bring it up at the end because it's a very interesting story about how Essek Hopkins ends up. So the Alfred is the first frigate. There it is at Philadelphia docks there. It's flying the Grand Union flag. You can see that's the flag they're going to be taking with them to down to the Bahamas itself. It's probably after it came back, perhaps after the raid, because the first flag to be flown was from the Providence, and that was John Paul Jones raising that one. But that's an interesting flag. Look at that; it's got the British Union Jack in the field there, and then the stripes on the side, like we would see in our flag today. Remember, they have this flag, and we have not yet declared independence, so it's still pre-independence. It's going to happen just a few months later in July 1776. And here's the sloop Providence, formerly called the Katy, a 12-gun sloop of war. I've sailed on this replica, the one that's sitting in Alexandria today. It is a gaff rig sloop, or where you're going to haul this thing up. It's a mainmast with a jib in the front, and it's not easy to sail. But it's a pretty effective small vessel. And the reason why these vessels are kind of available is because they are available. They're taken and bought by the Continental Congress to be converted into ships of war. They were formerly merchant ships or sloops that would be doing coastal trade. Now they're going to be ships of war for the time being. So Hopkins is going to send a message to the inhabitants of the Bahamas when he comes there. Just before, on 1 March, his squadron arrives offshore. He makes a number of tactical errors I'm going to talk about in a minute. He sets offshore for a while there. The British see this squadron, not quite what to make of it, and he sends a message eventually ashore, not right away, but he says, "To the gentlemen, freemen, and inhabitants of the island of New Providence, the reasons of my landing and armed force on the island is in order to take possession of the powder and warlike stores belonging to the crown. And if I am not opposed in putting my design in execution, the persons and property of the inhabitants shall be safe, neither shall they be suffered to be hurt in case they make no resistance." So he's saying, don't fight back. Just let me get what I need to get, and I'll leave you alone, and I'll be gone. And it's kind of what happens for the most part. So Nicholas is going to lead the Marine detachment on the Alfred frigate ashore, and Hopkins is going to eventually order the landing on the afternoon of 3 March 1776. It is the first expeditionary action on foreign soil. He's going to lead initially about 50 Marines and Blue Jackets. They're going to be followed on by follow-on waves, eventually getting up to about 200 personnel. They're going to take Forts Montagu and Nassau against very light opposition. They're going to see some guns and military stores, but they're going to find very little of the powder. Remember, this is a big story that was told later on that the Marines seized a lot of powder. It was destined for George Washington's Continental Army. Well, they don't get very much. In fact, because they pull up and they don't come ashore right away, the British royal governor, a guy named Brown, is going to be able to hide that powder for the most part. They do find a little bit of powder, but not much. On the return trip to Rhode Island, Hopkins is going to later fight an inconclusive engagement against a single combatant, the HMS Glasgow, of 20 guns. And this one single British ship is going to best his entire squadron. They call it the Battle of Block Island to this day. It is an embarrassment to the Continental Navy. First Marine casualties are going to occur in that fight on the way back from the raid. 2 lieutenants and 6 privates are killed in action. 4 privates are wounded. Nicholas again receives a promotion, gets 4 more companies to raise the Marine detachments on new Continental ships being built in Philadelphia, but Hopkins eventually gets canned. The Marines are landing again. Ships' boats are going to come ashore. It's a rather fanciful picture of them jumping over the boats and into the side. Note that one guy's falling right into the water. That happened to me when my first amphibious landing. I jumped out of a LCU and I went in over my head and had to swim. So it scared the heck out of me because I had all my gear on too. And I was like, oh my God, how deep am I going to go? Fortunately, it wasn't deep. Okay, operations ashore. Prior to the landing, the Hornet and the Fly, those two Maryland ships, they collided at sea. Hopkins decides to wait for them for a few days. Hornet never shows up. Fly eventually does, but only until March the 11th. This delay costs him 3 days, and that's the 3 days that Brown uses to hide the powder. The Americans are going to capture 2 British sloops trying to break out and escape. They provide intelligence about where the powder stores were and the fact that the forts are lightly manned. Hence, Hopkins makes a decision to go ashore on the 3rd. Most of the powder, as I said, has been hidden by Montford Brown aboard the HMS St. John and Mississippi Packet. They don't bother to look for these ships, and these ships get clean away with all the powder. So the whole idea of getting the powder for the Continental Army is blown up through the dilatory behavior of Essek Hopkins. Now, the Marines and Blue Jackets, again, as I said, land on that undefended beach right near Fort Montagu. They receive direct support that Providence and the Wasp are now moving into the harbor to provide. But due to the fatigue of the landing party, they had no rest for 2 previous days. They were busy getting marching around and getting ready to go. Hopkins delayed the assault on Fort Nassau, the other fort they're going to take, till the following day, 4 March. Both forts are taken without a fight. This is Fort Montagu today. You can still see it in the Bahamas. You can go down there to visit it, and not much of a fort, a little stone block square thing, and you see the cannons up there that were probably similar to the cannons that were up there before. By the way, Essek Hopkins and the Marines are going to take all military stores out of these forts and are going to take them back. There's going to be some fighting over the end result of what happened to those stores, but nevertheless, this is some advantage to taking these places. And again, you can see that it's not all that imposing a fort, but it's still there to this very day. The other fort, Fort Nassau, is not there anymore, although the west wing of the British Colonial Hilton Hotel forms where the Fort Nassau was. So if you go there on a cruise and you go to the British Colonial Hilton and you look at the west wing of the hotel, you'll see where Fort Nassau was, which was taken by the Marines and Navy in 1776. Fort Montagu, again, still there to this very day. Okay, there's the British Grand Union flag that's hoisted by none other than John Paul Jones. Pretty loud and colorful flag. I kind of like it. I still do. It is going to be flown. Very first time a naval vessel is going to fly this flag will be the attack on New Providence, and it's going to be hoisted by none other than First Lieutenant John Paul Jones. There he is right there. The raid on New Providence, Jones makes a real good reputation for himself. Remember now, he's not a captain. He was not given a captain's commission initially in the war, but his performance is so noteworthy that everybody recognizes this guy has leadership qualities that are going to really come to the fore in the next coming years. He's probably one of the finest naval commanders that we're going to have during the war. He's probably one of the most successful naval commanders. He now rests in a crypt in the basement of the U.S. Naval Academy's chapel. I've actually seen it. It's kind of a imitation of what they did for Horatio Nelson. And there's an old saying when I was at the Naval Academy, the nickname for Annapolis, Maryland is called Crabtown. And the mids used to say, everybody works in Crabtown, but John Paul Jones. So he's at rest in his crypt underneath the chapel. He was brought back there by none other than Theodore Roosevelt himself. Actually, not to be too graphic here, but I've actually seen pictures when they unsealed his sarcophagus. He was buried in a lead-lined, formaldehyde-filled coffin, and they found his grave in a deserted Paris cemetery in the early 1900s. They opened the coffin, and guess what? That's John Paul Jones. He looked just like the Houdin bust that sits in the in Mount Vernon in George Washington's home. And they quickly put it back on because they were worried about further decay, and they put him in the crypt, and that's where he is to this very day at the Naval Academy. So what is the New Providence raid aftermath? There's a lot of that. Okay, so the raid is pretty, I guess almost anticlimactic. They are going to remain ashore for almost 2 weeks, taking military stores, getting the cannon off of the battlements and any other things they could get. And they actually have to rent some ships in order to take this out. but there are no Americans or even British personnel are going to be killed. The only British resistance was limited to an initial cannon blast from Fort Montagu, and after they did their honorary firing of the cannon, the militia ran away. The British attempted to spike the cannon. Now, you may have heard that term before, spiking cannon. Well, what they did was there was a touch hole that would put powder in that would then go down into the barrel, and it would set the powder off that's inside the barrel. Well, to spike a cannon would be they would take a piece of metal or a spike, and they would literally break it off in that touch hole so that it would jam it up so you couldn't use it. Unfortunately, the militia were very ineffective at spiking the cannon. They thought they had effectively rendered them ineffective, but they were not. The Americans get most of that cannon usable. They get almost 88 pieces of ordnance out of the Bahamas, so it's not an insignificant amount of cannons. They only get about 24 casks of powder, but they do get a lot of small arms, provisions, and naval stores, which are going to go a long way to helping out the armed forces and the Continental Army ashore. Again, that heavy ordnance they're going to help with the defense of Fort Griswold later on during the war. It also improves the viability of surprise amphibious assaults. It's the first time that the Americans, of course, are going to use the Grand Union flag. It's raised on foreign soil. So this is a lot of interesting things. The Marine Corps is going to consider the raid on New Providence to be the forerunner of what they're going to be famous for in the 20th and 21st century, which is amphibious warfare. They're saying that this is the beginning of why we have a Marine Corps to this day. So this is how important this raid is. It proves that, hey, guess what? If you go ashore on an undefended beach and you go ashore by via surprise, you're likely going to not really take a lot of casualties, and you're also going to largely achieve your objective with a minimum of loss on your part. So that's a big deal for both the Navy and Marine Corps, and they carried it forward to the present day. Okay, we also talked about Essek Hopkins, and I always feel bad for him because I don't think he was as bad as people said he was, and he also gets kind of in hot water that's not of his own doing. As I said, I think the historian's name was Fowler. He said he was an ordinary man that unfortunately was placed in extraordinary times. But he arrives home in Rhode Island after the raid. He originally is lauded for his success, great success, but he's also kind of hounded by the failure. As they're coming back to Narragansett Bay, just past Block Island, which is also part of Rhode Island to this very day, they run across the HMS Glasgow, which is a 20-gun sloop of war that the British have, and it is well officered by a very first-rate captain and a really good crew. And remember now, Hopkins has about 8 ships with him. I don't think every one of them are there, but he has most of his major combatants, like the Columbus. He has the Cabot. He has the Providence. He has his own flagship, the Alfred. They way outgun this Glasgow, and the Glasgow runs circles around him. I mean, just beats up Alfred, beats up Columbus. I mean, Providence doesn't even get engaged. There's a one ship, Columbus keeps getting in the way of Alfred when they try to attack the other one. Alfred gets raked by the Glasgow when they lose steerage at one point because they take a round in its steering gear. It's really bad. I mean, it's an embarrassment. You know, that Hopkins's 8 ships could not take out one single British man of war. And so the crews get ashore after this performance, and they begin to complain about the sub-captains. And I can tell you about what happens to them. Eventually, as I said, Hopkins is going to get cashiered from the Navy in 1778, but the commander of the Providence, who doesn't engage in the fighting against the Glasgow, he's going to get cashiered from the Navy because he did for lack of aggressiveness. In fact, his command is going to be given to his first lieutenant, John Paul Jones. Captain Hazard is going to be kicked out, and the commanding officer, I believe, I can't remember if I have it right. It's the Columbus, I believe, is Abraham Whipple. He's later going to become infamous for when he tries to take a Continental Navy squadron to Charleston in 1780 and defend it against the Royal Navy and gets blown up down there. But he's accused of cowardice and has to come ashore to stand in front of a court-martial. He's later found not guilty of cowardice and under fire. However, he has that kind of cloud hanging over him. He's trying to kind of get rid of that cloud for the rest of the time he's in the Continental Navy. And then, of course, he loses it altogether when he goes down to Charleston and gets every single one of his ships taken out by the Royal Navy in that battle down there. And then, to make matters worse, Essek Hopkins. The crew complaints about performance of his sub-captains make their way to Congress, and eventually two whistleblowers, this is a true story, a guy named Marvin, another guy named Samuel Shaw, are going to complain that Hopkins tortured British POWs in Narragansett Bay after they had been captured. Now, that has never been actually proven, but Hopkins immediately sues both Marvin and Shaw for libel. And as a result, Congress passes its very first Whistleblower Act in 1778, providing not only legal protection to Marvin and Shaw, but also legal aid. They pay for the legal services for lawyers to represent them both because they blew the whistle on Hopkins in 1778. Now, I think a lot of the kind of the piling on of Hopkins is because the Southern colonists were really ticked off at him for not showing up. I think Thomas Jefferson later said he had no intention of ever coming to the Chesapeake. And he went for forever going on and saying that there was no way that Hopkins was ever going to come to the Chesapeake. And he says, and in fact, after the Bahamas raid, he could have come to the Carolinas. He could have come to South Carolina and North Carolina like Congress had wanted him to do, yet he comes straight back to Rhode Island. So that's what the Southerners are saying. I think part of this getting rid of Hopkins was their anger at the fact that he never showed up at the Chesapeake Bay in the first place. And again, I'm not so sure that Marvin and Shaw had any legitimacy in the claims they made against him. Nevertheless, it stuck. And if Congress does what Congress loves to do, which is have investigations. So they investigated it. It were inconclusive, but nevertheless, they decided to dismiss Hopkins from naval service on the 2nd of January, 1778. So we lose Essex Hopkins' services for the rest of the war. Be honest with you, by 1780, there is no Continental Navy to really talk about. It's either the French Navy or nothing, or maybe a state Navy or something like that, but that's about it. Almost every one of those original frigates that John Adams commissioned in 1775 met a bad end. Okay, so I'll stop here and we'll go to the questions. Okay, so with the questions, what I'd like to do is basically, we talked about the names of the ships, and I think I gave them all to you already. I like those Maryland ships, the Wasp, the Fly, and the Hornet, because to this very day, we still have we still have the Wasp and the Hornet. We have a USS Wasp. We've had a USS Hornet, was the famous aircraft carrier that launched the Jimmy Doolittle raid against Japan in 1942. And of course, the Alfred, the Cabot, those of the Columbus, those were the original ships and the names. The types of boats, as I said, were usually the ship's boats. They would be long boats that would be oar powered. They'd row them ashore, and that's how they got ashore. Drive them right up onto the beach. And what states did the participants come from? Again, most of the sailors are going to be from the Philadelphia area, some from Maryland, and some from Rhode Island. But for the most part, those are the three states that are going to be predominantly providing the sailors and the officers and the sea captains for these vessels. Are those three? It's interesting to note that the states providing the ships are going to be the ones providing the sailors and usually the leaders. George Washington actually loans some of his soldiers to become Marines on these ships. They were in Philadelphia, and he says, you can have these soldiers. They want to volunteer to serve on these ships for temporary duty. So they become instantaneous Continental Marines. And that's exactly what they were. So as a result of that, Washington, after they come back with the Hall, begins to argue with Hopkins and the Continental Congress about who should get some of the loot that came back, mainly the ordnance that Washington wanted to get. And there's a fight. It goes into Congress, and they fight over, how it's divvied up, how the prize money is given out, everything else. So were the ships well equipped for an operation like this? They were and they weren't. They were merchant ships that had been outfitted to become warships. What you really wanted to have are six or seven purpose-built warships. We don't get that until the Frigate Act of 1794. That's the famous USS Constitution, USS Constellation, Congress, President, etc. That's going to be commissioned under George Washington's second term. They're going to come out to sea. They're going to be first engaged in a quasi-war against France in 1778. They are going to become some of the best fighting ships ever produced by the United States. They dominate, for the ships of their size, the seas. They're called Super 44s. You want to see the Constitution? It sits up there in Boston Harbor. I actually retired from Marine Corps service on the deck of the USS Constitution in Boston. So they piped me over the side with a bosun's pipe as I went over. And 18th century sailors raised their caps as I went off the gangplank. It was really kind of cool. Okay. So, how trained were the Marines who took part in the landing? They were fairly well trained. They were trained in small arm use. They were trained in shipboard security, so they weren't too bad. Samuel Nicholas trained those guys again, but they weren't trained to be sailors. When Marines put to sea, they were not required to do duties as a seaman would do. They were not required to do very much duty at all. They were there to be security and landing party and do the fighting tops. Okay, so Essek Hopkins as a Commodore, was he unfairly shown the door after a year in service? That's a great question. I say he probably was, but he didn't really do himself any favors. He had some real big flaws. He wasn't the greatest leader. Although was he as bad as they heaped on the on top of his head at the end? I think it was revenge by the Southern delegates because they were upset that he had never showed up in the South in the first place. So how did the Marines know about supplies and their vulnerability? Well, they had some intelligence, but they also captured those sloops that were trying to escape just as Hopkins and the squadron were coming out. And they were saying, yeah, they got some stuff here. They knew that with 2 forts, there has to be something. There has to be powder to put in the cannons. There has to be military stores. And the Bahamas was largely undefended. They just had militia there. As we saw, they were very good. So what do we know about the intelligence the Americans had before the war? Well, they had some intelligence from sailors that had been in there before the war, as well as people who had been in and out. Remember now, the coastal trade was kind of what the Americans really focused on prior to the war. So there are going to be a lot of West Indies traffic, people stopping in there. A lot of sea captains and sailors would know about what's there, what isn't there. They knew about the forts. They knew about the supplies already beforehand. So how does Nassau compare to the British amphibious practices of the period? Pretty similar. The British are going to go ashore using longboats when they do amphibious raids. They're going to do that when they in the war, 7 Years' War, French Indian War, when they go ashore at Quebec, you can see the same boats loaded up with redcoats being rowed ashore, and then basically them working their way up to the Plains of Abraham in 1759 for that big battle. How does Nassau come? Okay, you already did that one. So, what are the outcomes of the raid? We covered that in the lecture. One question was remnants of the raid. Fort Montagu, as I said, still there, and of course the part of Fort Nassau is under the west wing of the British Colonial Hilton Hotel, which are still to be seen today. Who leads ashore? It's a good question. This is an old fight between the Marines and the Navy to this very day. Once the Marines go ashore, the Marines today will argue that the senior Marine then should be put in charge of as commander of the landing force, or Cliff. However, the commander of the amphibious task force is always a naval officer. That's called the CATIF. And as a result, there's always this friction. But back then, Hopkins turned over the initial command to Nicholas, and then eventually other sub-captains are going to come ashore with more blue jackets. They're going to take command. But again, it's mainly taking the supplies, getting them off the beach, and then loaded up onto vessels to be taken to the United Colonies at the time. So that's what they're trying to do. So for 2 weeks, it really is a loading out operation after the first day or two of just taking those 2 forts. So it is really it's a pretty straightforward operation. Navy captains coming ashore on occasion. I don't know if I've never read if Hopkins ever went ashore. I don't think he did. I think he remained aboard the Alfred the whole time. But other junior leaders, perhaps on the Wasp or others, may have went ashore for periods of time, and they're senior to Nicholas at that point. So they would be in charge. They're going to, again, as I said, they stayed ashore for 2 full weeks. They had to rent some local vessels in order to carry their loot away. It was so much. They actually changed out their stone ballast in their ships for cannonballs. That was a great choice. You need to have something heavy in the middle of the ship to keep it seaworthy. They call it ballast. So they take the stones out, they dumped it on shore, and they replaced it with cannonballs. So it did double duty. So they got the cannonballs out. So those are the ones I had written. And again, I'll just kind of open up for anybody else that wants. I see
yeah. We've got a couple more that have come in, Charlie. Thank you so much. We have a lot of people expressing their appreciation for a great lecture. But then there were a couple questions about privateering. How successful was privateering in the Revolutionary War? Did the Continental Congress issue letters of marque as well as commission ships?
They did. They issued letters of marque, but privateering could be great if you were successful. And every dream of every sailor back then was what I called the Grand Slam. getting a fat merchantman full of really valuable goods. They don't put up a fight. You take it out, you man it with a prize crew, you sail it back into a friendly port, you condemn the cargo and the vessel before a admiralty court, and then the money comes in. You could be like, it was like hitting the lottery, but it truly was like hitting the lottery for privateers. Most privateers, majority of privateers, uniformly unsuccessful. Many a privateer would take a prize only to be recaptured by a man of war later on. Britain's prisons were bulging with merchant sailors and privateermen who had been captured during the Revolution, and they were kept in prison from almost the entirety of the war. It was a harsh, brutal existence for them, and most of the privateers do not see the success. Occasionally, they would get that one, but again, that's all it takes is one. It's like, if I could only, maybe I'll hit the lottery this time, you know. It's like maybe
That's
I'll
right.
really get it going. So that's true. So very, very appreciated.
Yeah. And then this one's more of a technical question about the gunpowder. Was that usable, considering humidity and the
Yeah,
volatility
the
of
casts were pretty well kept so that they were weatherproof, and of course the powder is black powder, and again, it could, if it got damp, you could actually dry it if you had to. But the casts were pretty well sealed, and they were pretty good for keeping the moisture and humidity. Although obviously you don't want to have it there forever, you're
Mhm.
going to have some effect. But the powder itself is just plain black powder, and the problem with black powder to this very day is it's dirty. It's very it gums up the barrels. But the thing about naval guns are they're big and they're smooth bore. They're not rifled at the time, so all they are bludgeoning devices, and they're designed to fire a heavy iron cannonball fired into the side of the enemy combatant you're facing and knock down its mast or punch holes in its hull and that sort of thing. It's real hard to sink a wooden ship in the 18th century, as many of these sailors are going to find out. So, but on the other hand, it's important to understand that the powder itself is very important because we don't have a lot of it. Unfortunately, we don't get it in this rate. The Marines later on in their, I always call it, there's lore and there's history, and Marines just love the deal in lore. We brought all this powder back, and Washington was ecstatic. He got all this great powder from the Marines, thanks to the Marines. And it's just not the case. They got some, but not much at all.
Now, and this is my question, and maybe this everybody knows this one, but where did the powder come from? Like where?
Well, the UK, the United Kingdom got it, and they brought it over to the Bahamas because they were going to, store it in those forts for self defense. So they did this in Bermuda, they did this in Jamaica. They would bring barrels of it over, and they make the powder in the United Kingdom, and the powder works there, and then they put them in barrels, ship them over for the defense, and it was just like us putting ammunition stocks forward
Mm,
deployment, and that's what they were doing.
mm. Interesting. Now, just a couple more. Let's see. Was the Liberty ship Stephen Hopkins named for this Hopkins?
The Liberty ship Stephen Hopkins. I don't know. I have to look that up. Stephen Hopkins is spelled Stephen,
Yeah.
Stephen, and he was a kind of a character in Rhode Island. And if you see him, he's kind of wearing a slouch hat. He liked to drink and tell stories in taverns. That's why John Adams thought he was the greatest guy ever. He thought he was just very entertaining. And I think he's the governor at one point in Rhode Island too. But he is a very, very kind of hail fellow, well met sort of type. And he was 70 years old at the time during when the war broke out, but still
Hmm.
spry.
Now, let's one last question here, because you're a pro here. You end right on time. You're used to this. One question, last question. Where does John Glover and his Marblehead Regiment fit into the official Navy?
Well, they're typically John Glover is I can't say enough good things about him and his regiment. He is everywhere. During the beginning of the war, his Marblehead, Massachusetts-based regiment, largely sailors from that part of the country, they are going to form up into a land regiment, and they're going to volunteer for service in the Continental Army, and they're going to be in the Continental Army, especially in the New York campaign. But John Glover's guys are also going to help man George Washington's secret navy. I had that slide about Washington kind of on the slide going around Congress and getting a little squadron of schooners together that's going to help him interdict, because at the time Washington has got the British Army bottled up in Boston. It makes sense to keep them from getting resupplied from Halifax or from Bermuda. So he says, but we don't have any Navy out there to stop them from doing it. So they could stay there forever if we don't stop their supply run. So he and Congress is dithering around at the time. They won't get on the issue till later. So he says, I'll take matters into my own hands. And he gets some friends as well as local backers. And he says, let's put some boats out to sea, ships out to sea. And he makes this little secret navy. James Nelson writes a superb book about this book. And so he gets this navy out there, and they do some damage, but they don't do as much because there's just not enough of them. But John Glover's Marblehead, Massachusetts sailors volunteer for this little navy. So they would go back to their seafaring days for a temporary period of time. And this little navy is only around for about less than a year. So they go back. But then later on, they're going to go south with Washington's Continental Army to New York. And they're famously going to save George Washington's bacon after the Battle of Brooklyn Heights, where we are defeated catastrophically by the British on Long Island. Fog comes in, and they're going to bag the rest of the army. 1/3 of the army is going to get captured the next day. Fog comes in and basically surrounds the landing areas, and his Massachusetts Bay Marblehead sailors, now soldiers, row all night long back and forth across the Long Island Sound and the East River there to get the 1/3 of the remaining Washington's army back across to Manhattan so they're not captured the next day. Shock the British. The next day when the fog clears, Washington's army is now combined on Manhattan, and he could then make his fighting retreat up the island and eventually over to New Jersey. But it's thanks to John Glover that happens. And it's not the first time that John Glover saved George Washington's bacon.
This is also fascinating. Thank you so much. I'm going to echo what a lot of people are saying in the comments, which is thank you for a great presentation. I encourage folks, if you like this American Navy and American history content, we have two publications that you're going to want to check out and get on our mailing list. The first one is Tuesday Tidings, which is a weekly newsletter that will get you all of the Navy news and stories and book reviews. And then we also have started publishing or bringing back the International Journal of Naval History. So a really wonderful peer-reviewed journal, and that's free to read online at seahistory.org. So I encourage you to check those out. If you like us, you like this series, and you'd like to support us, you can do that by becoming a member. Again, seahistory.org, become a member. You can make a donation supporting this series and this great, fantastic work. Come again and join us next month on March 5th, where we'll be talking with Lincoln Payne, a fantastic maritime author, and he'll be focusing on the indigenous maritime culture of North America. So again, we're really trying to hit the whole spectrum of North American maritime history this year especially. So again, thank you all for joining us. Charlie, thanks for a fantastic presentation, and have a good evening.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate everything.